focus on one of New Zealand's greatest tragedies, the sinking of the Wahine.
Throughout tonight's show, we will try to find out as much as possible about the disaster so we as a nation can begin to understand this terrible tragedy.
On the morning of the 10th of April 1968, after an overnight voyage from Lyttelton, the ferry Wahine encountered the worst of a violent southerly storm, with winds gusting 106 and 160 kilometres per hour while entering the Wellington harbour, with passengers terrified and feeling very ill indeed. The captain and his crew attempted to get their ship back on course and out of danger. After many hours, the passengers and crew had to abandon ship and were flung out into the rough seas of the harbour in life rafts. They had to make the dangerous crossings to Wellington's rocky shores, where they were met by local Wellingtonians desperate to help. These rescuers could see the state of the harbour and understood how difficult the crossing had become, perhaps even before on board. We are lucky enough tonight to have footage recovered of a resident in the seaside village of Eastbourne back in 1968. They were among the many heroic rescuers on the fatal day. Our Wellington correspondent Holly with her night report.
Here we have Sophie Lesky, a very heroic rescuer. Thank you for joining us today, Sophie. You must be exhausted. What was it like rescuing survivors?
It was horrible because we didn't have enough time to put our life jackets on or warm clothes.
What was the first thing you thought about when you seen all of the suffering people?
Well, I was almost crying when I saw the suffering people.
Did you fear for your own life whilst saving others?
Yes, because they were all panicking and were dragging me under the water when I was trying to save them.
Thank you. Signing off a very bleak day in New Zealand's history.
Interesting interview. Our thanks to Holly for sending us that old report. Those unfortunate enough to have been in the Wahine on the 10th of April 1968 had to deal with a very rough night and day. Many passengers were throwing up continuously those extremely rough seas. The passengers were all told that the storm would pass and to hold tight. Most thought it was a typical Wellington southerly storm and that the Wahine would just ride it out. Unfortunately, at 6:41 a.m, the Wahine was carried onto the rocks of Barrett Reef, sustaining serious damage to the length of her hull. The starboard, that's right to us landlubbers, and the port, that's left, engine stopped working. The anchors were dropped, but it was some time before they held firm. Rescue attempts were made impossible by the raging gales and massive swells. By early afternoon, all 734 passengers and crew were ordered to abandon ship and get into the life rafts. Only 4 of the 8 could be used because of the angle of the now sinking ship. All 734 people on the ship managed to escape, but due to the stormy seas, 51 lost their lives. We can only imagine what those giant waves looked like to those people in the small life rafts, or worse, for those who had capsized. Our film technicians have found some much damaged footage of 2 survivors, filmed only hours after the disaster in the Civil Defence shelter. We have carefully cleaned and restored the film. This is the first time it has been shown on New Zealand public TV. Let's roll that footage now.
How are you? Are you okay? Oh gosh, are you warm enough? Okay. Are we rolling now? Right. I'm Olivia, and joining with me now is a survivor from today's disaster. What was it like out there?
It was scary, and people were screaming in my ears. I can't see. And the boat was on a huge lane, and it was very hard to stand up. What made it worse was the weather.
How did you get into the lifeboat?
Well, the boat was on a lane, and the lifeboats were on the side, and I slid down the boat and landed in one. But then it capsized.
How did you feel when you got told to abandon ship?
I felt really worried because I was really scared that I would fall into the water, and I was worried about my 3 children because I was wondering how I would cope with losing them.
And we're out of time. Get this girl a hot drink.
New Zealand history. We are so lucky to have amazing technology that allows us to view it. And now let us look at human error being the possible reason for the sinking of the Wahine. Captain Hector Gordon Robertson, being master of the ill-fated ferry for some time, he had sailed her to and from Wellington numerous times in strong winds and high seas, and was an experienced captain. It was Captain Robertson's decision to enter the harbour when they did. They had arrived 20 minutes behind schedule when 3 gusts of 100 knots or more struck the vessel and put them out of line. He was quoted at the time as saying, "If those winds had struck 5 minutes later, we would have been through the entrance and could have come down the harbour. We could have come down and dropped the anchor in Oriental Bay, where it was quite calm." Some people suggest that Captain Robertson was too late in his decision to put the passengers into life rafts. They had suggested they should have been evacuated much earlier. Captain Robertson, however, feels that he made the right decision, saying, "People who say that don't know what they are talking about. If I had put them off any earlier, every one of them would have been lost. I would have had 600 lives on my conscience." In a moment, we will take a closer look at the weather on that fateful day. But now let's look at an interview given by Charlotte in 1972. This interview may give us some insight as to what was happening on the bridge that day.
Hi, I'm Charlotte, and joining me now is Captain Robertson. Why did you decide to bring the ship into the harbour when you knew the weather was bad?
I thought the ship was handling the weather okay at the time.
After the ship capsized, there were many very heroic deeds. Would you like to comment on them?
I was very proud of my crew. They saved many lives and risked their own for the welfare of others.
Do you feel responsible for the loss of lives in the disaster?
Of course I feel responsible. I'm the captain. But the loss of radar and difficulty of passengers took the fate of passengers out of my hands.
Thanks for your time, Captain Robertson. Fascinating old footage there. Let's look at the weather on the 10th of April 1968. It certainly was a terrible day to be stuck outside in New Zealand. Cyclone Giselle was reported on the 5th of April in 1968 when it hit French Caledonia with storm warnings issued throughout New Zealand the next day. Early on the 9th of April, Cyclone Giselle hit Cape Reinga. Winds of up to 160 kilometres an hour caused massive damage to buildings. Torrential rain flooded farmland in Northland, drowning hundreds of farm animals. A farmer who was also killed when he was blown off a haystack. The cyclone's pattern of damage continued as it travelled across the North Island, but turned south down the east coast. Ships were driven ashore and landslips closed roads. Rain caused massive floodings and wind left roofs torn off and windows broken. By the time the cyclone Gisela hit Wellington on the morning of the 10th of April, another storm had driven up the west coast of the South Island from Antarctica. The two storms met over the capital, causing huge damage. Winds in Wellington were the strongest ever recorded, at one point reaching speeds of 275 kilometres an hour. As the storm moved on to the South Island, hundreds of Christchurch houses lost their roofs, and both the Avon and the Heathcote River flooded. Throughout Canterbury, over 500 hectares of forest were destroyed. In Southland, the flooding was the worst since 1913. Some people were stranded on the roofs of their houses and had to be rescued by jet boats. Cyclone Giselle finally blew out somewhere in the Southern Ocean. And there you have it, folks. Perhaps if weather forecasting could have been then what it is now, the Wahine disaster would have never happened. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you there, Gretchen. What an incredible storm it must have been.
Well, that's all we have time for this evening. We hope you have learnt something about your country's history and about one of the darkest days. Please join us next week when we focus on the Springbok tour of 1981.
Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you again next time. From the whole team at Spotlight on New Zealand,
Good night
and Nohora.